Imagine standing before a pillar so tall that your neck strains to see its peak. Imagine walls carved from mountains themselves, architecture so magnificent that it defied the imagination of ancient travelers. Now, imagine all of it. Every tower, every palace, every trace of human ambition reduced to dust by a wind that howled for 8 consecutive days and 7 consecutive nights. The people who built these wonders weren't just skilled. According to Islamic tradition, they were physically different from us, taller, stronger. They moved boulders we'd need machinery to shift. They reshaped landscapes with their bare hands. They were called the Odd, and at the height of their power, they believed nothing could touch them. But here's what haunts me about their story. They didn't fall because they were weak. They fell because they became too strong. Or at least, they thought they were. And somewhere in the ruins of their forgotten empire lies a warning so urgent that the Quran mentions them nearly 30 times. A warning that echoes across millennia, arriving at our doorstep today with unsettling relevance. By the end of this story, you'll understand why their fate wasn't just a punishment. It was a mercy in disguise. But that revelation waits at the end. For now, let's go back. Back to a time when giants walked the earth. After the great flood receded and the Ark of Noah settled upon Mount Judy, humanity began again. The descendants of Noah, peace be upon him, scattered across the earth, and from his son, Shem, came the Arabs. Among these early Arab tribes, few would become as legendary or as cautionary as the people of Ad. They settled in a region called Al-Ahqaf, described in the Quran as a place of winding sand dunes. Historical and geographical evidence points to an area in what we now know as southern Arabia, stretching through parts of modern-day Yemen and Oman. It was a land blessed with fertility, positioned along ancient trade routes where the desert met more temperate zones. Rivers flowed, gardens flourished, the earth yielded its treasures readily. But it wasn't just the land that made Ad remarkable. It was the people themselves. Allah describes them in Surah Al-Fajr with a question that reverberates through time. Have you not considered how your Lord dealt with Ad, Iram of the pillars, the likes of whom had never been created in the land? Iram, the city of pillars. Classical scholars like Ibn Kathir tell us these weren't ordinary pillars. Some interpretations suggest they were monumental columns supporting structures of unprecedented scale. Others say the people themselves were called people of pillars because of their extraordinary height and strength. They stood like pillars. The physical descriptions we find in authentic Islamic sources paint a picture almost mythological in scope. These were a people of tremendous stature. While exact measurements vary across scholarly interpretations, the consistent theme is clear. They were significantly taller and more powerful than the humans who came after them. They could uproot trees with ease. Their strength in construction was unmatched. and they used that strength well, at least initially. The odd didn't just survive in their environment, they dominated it utterly. They became master builders, architects who worked not with wood and clay like other nations, but with stone and mountain itself. The Quran captures their architectural pride in Surah Ash-Shu'ara, where their own words echo, "Do you build on every high place a monument for vanity? And do you take for yourselves palaces and fortresses that you might abide eternally?" Picture it. Across every prominent hilltop and strategic position, they erected structures meant to announce their presence. These weren't humble dwellings. These were declarations. Monuments that said, "We are Ad, and we are eternal." They carved fortresses into mountainsides, creating strongholds they believed impregnable. They built palaces with engineering sophistication that made travelers marvel. Their land produced abundantly. Their orchards stretched wide. Their livestock multiplied. Their trade brought wealth from distant lands. Every metric by which a civilization measures success, they had surpassed it. The blessings were undeniable, and that's precisely where the danger began. There's a subtle poison that can seep into the human heart when success compounds upon success. It whispers, "You did this. Your strength built this. Your intelligence created this." It transforms gratitude into entitlement and entitlement into arrogance. For Ad, this transformation happened gradually. The generation that had known struggle and built the first foundations might have still remembered to be thankful, but their children inherited strength without the struggle. They were born into tall palaces and looked out over vast estates and came to believe that this was simply the natural order, that they were superior by nature, not by blessing. The Quran records their attitude in Surah Fussilat. Who is greater than us in strength? That single question reveals everything. They had begun to measure reality by their own power. In their worldview, might validated right. Their physical strength became their philosophy, their theology, their justification for everything. They stopped asking where their strength came from. They stopped questioning what it was for. They assumed it was theirs by right, permanent by nature, and unchallengeable by any force in existence. Worship became corrupted. Instead of recognizing the one who created them and gave them strength, they turned to idols, powerless statues that reflected their own desire for control. These stone gods asked nothing of them, made no moral demands, required no humility. They were perfect deities for a people who wanted blessing without accountability. And into this civilization, at the peak of its power and the depth of its delusion, Allah sent a messenger. His name was Hud, and he was one of them. This is a crucial detail. Hud wasn't a foreigner bringing strange ideas from distant lands. He was from Ad itself, from one of their own respected lineages. He spoke their language fluently, understood their culture intimately, and shared their heritage completely. They couldn't dismiss him as an outsider who didn't understand their ways. Hud's message was simple and uncompromising. "O my people, worship Allah. You have no deity other than Him. Then will you not fear Him?" Notice the structure of that call. It wasn't primarily about rituals or complex theology. It was about recognition, acknowledging the true source of their blessings, and about consequence, understanding that power comes with responsibility and misuse comes with reckoning. Hud reminded them of what should have been obvious. And remember when he made you successors after the people of Nuh and increased you in stature extensively. So remember the favors of Allah that you might succeed. He was pointing them back to their own history. You didn't create yourselves. You were given this strength. You inherited this earth. These are gifts, not accomplishments. And gifts come from a giver who has the right to be acknowledged. The response from the leadership of Ad was swift and scathing. The elite of Ad looked at Hud, this man who challenged their entire worldview, and they saw not a prophet, but a problem. His message threatened everything their society was built upon: the primacy of strength, the permanence of their power, the self-directed nature of their existence. Their responses, preserved in the Quran, reveal the classic patterns of rejection we see repeated throughout history. First, they attacked his credibility. Indeed, we see you in foolishness, and indeed, we think you are of the liars. This is the ad hominem dismissal. Don't engage with the message. Discredit the messenger. Hud responded with dignified clarity. O my people, there is not foolishness in me, but I am a messenger from the Lord of the worlds. I convey to you the messages of my Lord, and I am to you a trustworthy advisor. When personal attacks didn't work, they shifted to mockery. They ridiculed the very idea that they should abandon the gods their fathers worshipped. Tradition became their shield against truth. You have only come to us to turn us away from our gods, they accused. So bring us what you threaten us with, if you should be of the truthful. There's a dangerous bravado in that challenge. They were essentially daring divine punishment, so confident in their own invulnerability that they couldn't imagine any force could humble them. Hud warned them repeatedly. He painted vivid pictures of nations before them who had also thought themselves immune to accountability. He spoke of the pattern: blessing, arrogance, warning, and then, if the warning goes unheeded, reckoning. But the Ad had an answer to every argument, and that answer always circled back to the same core belief: who is greater than us in strength? Their own power had become their god, even if they didn't articulate it that way. And so they continued, building their monuments, accumulating their wealth, celebrating their strength, and dismissing the lone voice calling them back to reality. Years passed like this. Hud continued preaching. The people continued rejecting, and above them both, the scales of divine patience were tilting toward their limit. The change began subtly, or perhaps it wasn't subtle at all, but they refused to see it for what it was. The rains, which had always come in their season, began to fail. At first, it might have seemed like a minor fluctuation, the kind of variation that happens naturally. But days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months. The sky remained closed. Their abundant gardens began to wither. The rivers that had flowed reliably started to shrink. Pastures turned brown, then bare. The livestock, once fat and numerous, grew lean. The earth that had yielded so generously now cracked under the unrelenting sun. This was the first stage of divine warning. Not destruction, but constriction. A tightening of circumstance meant to turn hearts back to their source. Because sometimes we only remember God when the blessings pause. Hud stood among them and explained what was happening. And O my people, ask forgiveness of your Lord, and then repent to him. He will send rain from the sky upon you in showers, and increase you in strength to your strength. And do not turn away, being criminals. Notice the promise embedded in that call to repentance. Even now, even after their years of arrogance and rejection, the door to mercy was wide open. Return, and not only will the punishment be lifted, but you'll be given even more than you had before. You'll be increased in the very strength you're so proud of. But the leaders of Odd couldn't see past their own worldview. To repent would be to admit they'd been wrong. To seek forgiveness would be to acknowledge a power greater than themselves. Their pride had calcified into something impenetrable. They responded with sarcasm. "O Hud, you have not brought us clear evidence, and we are not ones to leave our gods on your say-so, nor are we believers in you." Then they said something chilling. "We only say that some of our gods have possessed you with evil." In other words, they attributed his message not to divine inspiration, but to divine punishment, that their idols had struck him with madness for speaking against them. They had so inverted reality that they saw the prophet as cursed and themselves as blessed, even as their crops failed around them. The point of no return. The drought intensified. What had been merely difficult became desperate. The people of Odd, for all their strength, could not command the sky to open. They could not engineer their way out of thirst. Their mighty fortresses offered no protection against hunger. Finally, they decided to take action. But not the action Hud had advised. They wouldn't humble themselves before the Creator. Instead, they would try to appease him through their traditional means. According to classical exegesis, they sent a delegation to Makkah, to the vicinity of the sacred house, that even in those ancient times was recognized as a place of prayer, to seek rain. These weren't just any representatives. They were among their leaders and noblemen. But even this appeal was tainted by their arrogance. They didn't go seeking forgiveness or acknowledging their wrongs. They went demanding relief, as if they were owed it. And here, the divine response was both symbolic and terrible. The sky above them began to change. Clouds appeared on the horizon, but not the gentle rain clouds they desperately needed. These clouds were different, dark, dense, approaching with an ominous speed. The Quran describes what happened next in Surah Al-Ahqaf. And when they saw it as a cloud approaching their valleys, they said, "This is a cloud bringing us rain. Rather, it is that for which you were impatient. A wind, within it a painful punishment." Think about that moment. They saw the sign of their destruction and mistook it for their salvation. They looked at the instrument of their doom and celebrated it as relief. They were so disconnected from reality, so insulated by their assumptions, that they couldn't recognize the answer to their own challenge. "So bring us what you threaten us with." Now it was here. 8 days and 7 nights. The wind began as winds do, with a whisper, a shift in the air. But this was not a natural wind. This was a wind with a purpose, unleashed by divine command. The Quran describes it in multiple places, each description adding another layer of horror. It was a screaming wind, Surah Al-Ahqaf. It was a barren wind that brought no rain, no relief, only destruction, Surah At-Tariyat. It was a freezing wind, in some translations, bitter and cutting, Surah Fusilat. For 7 nights and 8 days, the Quran is precise about the duration. This wind howled through the land of Odd. It was continuous, unrelenting, unnatural in its persistence and its power. What happened to the mighty people of Odd, the nation that had asked, "Who is greater than us in strength?" The wind lifted them. These giants, these men of legendary stature and power, were picked up like dried leaves and hurled through the air. It smashed them against their own monuments, their own fortresses, their own proud pillars. It threw them to the ground with such force that they shattered. The Quran paints the scene with stark poetry. You would see the people therein fallen as if they were hollow trunks of palm trees. Hollow trunks, not just dead, but emptied. Their strength meant nothing. Their height became a disadvantage, more surface for the wind to catch. Their fortresses, which they'd built to last forever, became their tombs. The very monuments they'd erected to their own greatness stood as grave markers over their destruction. For 8 days, the wind erased them, and then, as suddenly as it had come, it stopped. The silence after. When the wind finally ceased, travelers who later passed through the region found a landscape transformed. Where once stood proud cities, there were now ruins half buried in sand. The pillars of Aram lay broken. The fortresses gaped empty. Of the people themselves, only remnants remained, bones bleaching in the sun, scattered structures testifying to a civilization that had touched greatness and grasped at permanence, only to find both slipping through their fingers like the sand that now covered everything. But not everyone perished. The Quran tells us that Hud and those who believed with him were saved. Classical sources suggest they were a small group. Some narrations say they numbered only a few thousand compared to the multitudes of Ad. They were sheltered by divine protection while the wind raged around them, untouched in the midst of catastrophe. After the destruction, Hud and the believers left the land of their birth. They had survived, but they could not stay among the graves of a nation that had refused to listen. The story of Ad entered human memory. Their name became a watchword, a cautionary tale. Travelers through Arabia would point to ruins and whisper, "This was a D." The Quran would mention them again and again, not with glee at their destruction, but as a sober reminder to every generation that would come after. Now, you might be wondering, is there any evidence that Ad actually existed, or is this merely mythology? It's a fair question, and the answer is intriguing. There are no archaeological discoveries that definitively prove here was Ad, exactly as the Quran describes. But there are tantalizing hints. Ruins of advanced ancient civilizations in southern Arabia. References in pre-Islamic poetry to legendary peoples of great strength. Structures that speak to engineering capabilities that seem anomalous for their time period. In recent decades, satellite imaging and ground surveys have revealed extensive networks of ancient settlements in the Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter, buried beneath the sands. Some researchers have pointed to these as potentially related to the people mentioned in Quranic accounts. But here's the thing. For believers, the lack of definitive physical evidence doesn't negate the truth of the account. The Quran isn't primarily a history textbook meant to satisfy archaeological curiosity. It's a book of guidance, and it tells the story of Ad, not so we can take up their bones, but so we can examine our own hearts. And when we do that, when we look at the pattern of their rise and fall, we start to see something unsettling. We start to see ourselves. Let's trace the arc of Ad's story. They were given extraordinary blessings, strength, resources, land, talent. They used those blessings to build a remarkable civilization. Success followed success. But gradually, imperceptibly, the source of blessing faded from their consciousness. They began to attribute their success to their own inherent superiority. Strength became their measure of truth. When challenged to consider their accountability, they responded with mockery and defiance. When warnings came, they doubled down on their position. They couldn't imagine that their power might be temporary, that there might be a force greater than themselves. that there might be consequences for arrogance, until reality arrived in the form of a wind that their walls couldn't stop. Now consider, isn't this the story of every empire that has fallen? Rome, Persia, the colonial powers. The pattern repeats with eerie consistency. And isn't this the story of our own civilization right now? We live in an age of unprecedented human power. We've split the atom. We've mapped the genome. We've built machines that think and networks that span the globe. We reshape landscapes, redirect rivers, and manipulate the building blocks of life itself. And increasingly, we've begun to ask the same question Ard asked: who is greater than us in strength? We see it in our technology titans who speak of solving death itself. We see it in our political rhetoric that treats human will as the ultimate authority. We see it in our economic systems that acknowledge no limit to growth. We see it in our cultural narratives that celebrate the autonomous self, accountable to no one and nothing beyond its own desires. We build our monuments, towers of glass and steel reaching toward the sky, and we believe they'll stand forever. We accumulate our wealth and secure our positions and tell ourselves we're too advanced, too sophisticated, too powerful to face the kind of reckoning that ancient peoples faced. But here's what the story of Ard whispers to us across the centuries. Strength is not the same as security. Power is not the same as permanence. And no civilization, no matter how mighty, is beyond accountability. The mercy hidden in the warning. I told you at the beginning that there was a revelation waiting at the end of this story. Here it is. The destruction of Ard was not primarily a punishment. It was a mercy. I know that sounds paradoxical. How can the obliteration of an entire nation be called mercy? Think about it this way. If Ard had continued unchecked, what would they have become? Their arrogance was already totalizing. Their power was already being used oppressively. Their disconnection from truth was already complete. If they had gone on for another century, another millennium, how much deeper would their spiritual corruption have grown? How many more generations would have been born into a civilization that taught them might makes right, that denied ultimate accountability, that celebrated the ego as God? Sometimes, the merciful thing is to end a pattern before it can perpetuate itself into infinity. And the warning itself, preserved in the Quran, repeated through history, told and retold for 1,400 years, that warning has potentially saved millions. Every person who has heard the story of Ard and paused to consider their own arrogance, who has checked their own pride, who has remembered that strength is a trust and not a right, that person has benefited from a mercy that outlived Ard themselves. The wind destroyed their bodies, but the story of the wind has been saving souls ever since. This is the pattern of divine pedagogy throughout the Quran. Nations aren't punished arbitrarily. They're warned extensively. Prophets are sent from among their own people. Signs are given. Time is provided for reflection and return. And when the reckoning finally comes, it comes as the last resort, not the first response. And then the story is preserved, not to celebrate the destruction, but to prevent the next one. So where does that leave us? We've journeyed together through the rise and fall of a forgotten nation. We've seen how blessing can turn to arrogance, how strength can become a weakness, how the very gifts we're given can become the instruments of our testing. The lessons for our lives today are profound and immediate. First, recognize the true source of your blessings. Whatever strength you have, intellectual, physical, financial, social. It isn't ultimately self-generated. You didn't choose your DNA. You didn't select your birthplace or the historical moment you entered. Even your hardest-won accomplishments were achieved with faculties you were given. This isn't meant to diminish your effort. It's meant to restore perspective. Gratitude is the antidote to arrogance. Second, understand that power is a trust, not a trophy. The question isn't, how much have I achieved? But, what am I doing with what I've been given? Every position of influence, every resource at your disposal, every talent you possess, these are tools entrusted to you. The test is whether you'll use them in service of truth and justice, or in service of your own ego. Third, stay open to correction. The leaders of Odd couldn't imagine they were wrong. They'd built their entire identity around their strength and their rightness. So, when truth came to them, they couldn't receive it. It would have meant dismantling their self-image. Ask yourself, am I humble enough to be corrected? Can I admit when I'm wrong? Or have I surrounded myself with certainties that protect my ego, but distance me from reality? Fourth, read the signs while there's still time. The drought was a warning for Odd, but they interpreted it through their existing assumptions rather than seeing it as a call to change. In your own life, when things start to constrict, when relationships fracture, when inner peace evades you, when success feels hollow, don't just try to solve the problem at surface level. Ask the deeper question, what is this trying to teach me? What might I need to change? And finally, remember that no condition is permanent except the truth itself. Civilizations rise and fall. Empires turn to dust. The monuments we think will last forever crumble. But the truth about who we are, why we're here, and what we're accountable to, that remains constant. Building your life on anything less is building on sand, no matter how impressively you stack it. The story of Odd is an ancient history filed away in some irrelevant past. It's a mirror held up to every age, including ours. It asks us to examine honestly. Are we becoming like them? Are we measuring reality by our own power? Are we building monuments to ourselves and calling it progress? Are we so confident in our trajectory that we can't imagine it leading anywhere but up? These are uncomfortable questions, but they're necessary ones, because the difference between wisdom and folly often comes down to a simple willingness. The willingness to learn from those who came before, to take seriously the patterns that keep repeating, to recognize that we are not exceptions to the rules that govern human flourishing and human failure. You made it to the end of this journey, and I hope you found something valuable in it. Something that shifts your perspective, that challenges your assumptions, or that simply reminds you of truths you already knew, but perhaps had forgotten. If this story resonated with you, if you believe these kinds of deep explorations into timeless wisdom matter in our modern world, then I'd like to invite you to join our community here at Veritas Frame. We create content that doesn't just entertain or inform, but that genuinely helps us all navigate the profound questions of meaning, purpose, and accountability that our contemporary culture often glosses over. Your subscription isn't just a number to us, it's a signal that this work matters, that there's an audience hungry for substance over superficiality, for wisdom over mere information. It helps us continue dedicating the time and research needed to bring these stories to life with the accuracy and depth they deserve. And if you found particular value in this episode, share it with someone who might need to hear it. Because stories like this, stories that humble us, that reorient us, that remind us of what truly matters, They become more powerful when they're passed along. The people of art are gone, but their lesson lives on. Let's make sure we're the generation that actually learns from it. Until next time, stay curious, stay humble, and remember, true strength isn't found in dominating others or in monuments that touch the sky. True strength is found in recognizing the one who gave you strength in the first place and using it the way he intended, with justice, with mercy, and with the knowledge that we're all ultimately accountable. Thank you for watching.